Hello and welcome back to IllumiNation, the Disney Lorcana podcast. My name is Max.
And I'm Sam.
And we are back at you with another episode of the podcast. This week, we are talking about mulligans. Sam, what is a mulligan?
A mulligan is when you draw your original hand of 7 cards and you put back however many cards you'd like that you do not want in your opening hand, and then you draw that many cards.
So for example, if I have 7 cards and then I decide I don't want 3 of them, I put 3 back on the bottom of my deck and then draw the top 3 cards of my deck to replace them?
That is correct.
And then I shuffle my deck.
That is also correct.
And then I allow my opponent to cut that deck.
Yep.
Okay. So we know what a mulligan is. So that's how you mulligan, in case you didn't know that. Every game is a little different with mulligans. I'm not trying to be like hyperbolic or make anybody feel excluded by going over that, but that is in fact how you do it in Disney Lorcana. There was a similar version to that early in Magic's history called the partial Paris mulligan. So very similar cues to that. So why do you want to mulligan, Sam?
Well, the biggest reason you want a mulligan is so that you have a better chance of having a game.
So you would say the why would be to avoid non-games.
Yeah, I would definitely say you don't want to have a bunch of cards that do nothing in your original hand. So that would give you a non-game.
Yeah, I think that's a fair evaluation. From a card design perspective, one of the worst things you can do is have a game wherein one player just doesn't simply get to play. And this happens a lot because of the land mechanic in a game like Magic. The reason why we've seen a lot of trading card games since then move away from that particular way to pace the game and resource the game. They've moved into other versions of that, like Lorcana, where you get to ink any card that is inkable. So there is definitely some advantage there. And what's the goal with a mulligan, Sam? What is my goal as a player who's taking a mulligan?
Your goal is to get a good opening hand for whatever reason that may be, whether it's a good curve, whether it's good against the opponent deck you're playing.
So my goal is to get the best hand possible.
Yes.
I think that's a fair evaluation as well. So when it comes to a mulligan, how we described it, you put some number of cards back on the bottom of your deck, you take that same number from the top of your deck, and then you shuffle and you let your opponent cut. Why are we doing this? Well, it's to avoid non-games and make the game as fun as possible for both or all the players involved if you're playing multiplayer. And finally, the goal here to have the best hand possible so that you can have the most fun game possible. Hopefully it's competitive, hopefully it's close, and hopefully it is exciting. And that is the goal there for mulligans. So let me take a brief moment, and we all know when I say that it's going to be long-winded, to give you kind of a quick warning. Mulligans are extremely difficult. It is one of the hardest skills to gain in a trading card game. Mulliganing is no joke. The same goes for Lorcana. In this particular game, it is very, very hard to mulligan. So you need to take the time to think out what you are going to be mulliganing, and all of the factors to influence that decision will change. They'll change based on what game you're on. They will change based on what deck you're playing against. They will change based on what cards are in your hand. They will change based on what the game plan of your deck is. Don't worry, I will go over all of this more. But I just want you to imagine that if you would say your mulligan skills are a 3 out of 10, maybe good, thoughtful preparation and us getting you thinking a little bit more about mulliganing as a process, maybe that gets you to a 6 or a 7 out of 10. But if you want to get to that 9 out of 10 and be a really good player and a really good mulliganer, you will have to practice. And I'm not talking about just in general. I'm talking about you have to get good at mulliganing with every deck. That's part of piloting a deck well, is learning how to mulligan with that deck. And that changes for every deck you play, and it changes based on what game of the match you're in. So there is so much to unpack with mulligans. This is going to be a very basic overview, but I think it's worth noting how some of the things change in Lorcana versus other games, and we want to unpack some of that for you today. So I think this will be a really good mulligan primer for us. But if you're going into this thinking in 20 minutes, I'm going to become the best at mulligans there is, I got bad news. We're not the best at mulligans. I've been mulliganing for a very long time, and I'm still not the best at it every time. But these are some practical things I take into each and every game that I play when I need to make a mulligan. So it just makes sense to review it here. So Sam, what do you think about mulliganing? Do you think it's nerve-wracking? Do you think it's relatively easy? Is there decks you've had more easy of a time mulliganing than others? Do you tend to mulligan a lot, a little?
I don't really tend to mulligan a lot unless my hand makes it to where I have to, if that makes any sense. I'm pretty conservative, I think, in the way I mulligan. I wouldn't say it's an easy thing, but I think I've been on Ruby Amethyst now for the past 2 sets. So I think with that deck, I've gotten pretty good at mulliganing with it and knowing what I need. Now, that being said, there's still times where I don't get the cards I need, and that really sucks.
So when you're mulliganing and you're doing this, what is your mission statement? What are you setting out to do most of the time?
For me, it's to have a good curve going into the game.
So you're going to have good options throughout the first few turns of the game.
Correct. I'm more worried about the beginning 3-4 turns than I am the rest. I'll keep a hand as long as it has at least a turn 2 play. That's not a snake that just kills itself if it doesn't have anything to pick up. I'm looking for, 1, 2, 3, and then I'm okay with just inking the rest of the cards for the most part, I'd say.
Okay. I think that's pretty fair evaluation, most players. And I'm not trying to put Sam too on the spot. She did not know I was going to ask her that question. I'm sure all of you could tell. And the reason I want to ask her that is because articulating the reasons that you want to mulligan and understanding what you're trying to accomplish with the mulligan is super duper important. And it's super duper difficult to accomplish.
And it definitely changes. In game 1, I'm looking for that smooth curve that can kind of just do well no matter what deck I'm playing. Whereas game 2, if I'm playing an aggro deck, I want something that's going to take care of those early threats. That doesn't necessarily have those because it just takes a while to get to that removal and things like that.
Instead of keeping those 5 cost and 6 cost inkables, you might mulligan those in games 2 and 3 against the aggro match to try to draw the relevant stuff.
Right, like I want my Pinocchios and my Foxes, things that are going to take out their little...
Your Teeth and Ambitions.
Yeah, Teeth and Ambitions is a perfect example.
Absolutely, because there's some games where that is stone cold unplayable, and it's just insta ink. Yep, but there are other games where Teeth and Ambitions makes all the difference. The fact that you can go and trade in and then be able to put Teeth and Ambitions on a different character lets you 2-for-1 the opponent, and that's how you can generally navigate things like the aggro decks. So it's really important to understand the reason and the goal you're trying to accomplish. And again, this is going to be modal, right? It's going to change depending on the game. It's going to depend on if you're on game 2 or 3. It's going to depend on what matchup you're in. It's going to depend on what deck you're playing. So what are some reasons that you might want to mulligan? Give yourself options is really important, right? Like if you're playing something like a Ruby Amethyst control deck, you need to be able to adapt to what the opponent is doing. That's how control decks work, right? They need to slow down what you're doing so they can take over control of the game. Those options are really important. If you're on a handful of uninkables and you just have to ink the good early cards, there's a good chance you're not going to be able to beat the aggro deck's quick start. The other option might be something like key cards, right? This is a really important one if your strategy revolves in Lorcana around 1 or 2 very specific cards. A deck that comes to mind that I've played a decent amount of is the Emerald Steel discard style decks. These decks very heavily lean around Bucky in order to make your opponent start to discard while you play your Floodborn characters. So I would do what's called a hard mulligan, and we'll get more into that as we go, in order to try to find Bucky at all costs in some matchups. There are some matchups where if I can't find Bucky, I have a very high chance that I'm going to lose that game. Where if I can find 1 Bucky, or even sometimes in the Magical Christmas lane where you get 2 Buckies, you can just win the game by doing basically nothing. You just pay for your characters, play them, and they have no resources left. It's really like it's just the deck runs on its own. So a deck may want to do something like the hard mulligan in order to find a key card. Another thing that is really important is inkability. That goes alongside of options. Having the ability to ink something that you want to ink versus something that you have to ink is pivotal. And there are some times where you're not going to have that luxury. If you get too greedy with your mulligans, you put yourself in position to where you can get many uninkables, and it can be quite untenable for you. And then finally, one of the other big considerations is what Sam alluded to already in her kind of number one rationale for mulligans, especially in game one, is having a curve. I want to be able to do something in the first few turns of the game in order to impact the board, the tempo of the game. We've discussed tempo a little bit before. So I want to add to the board. I want to transfer and translate cards in hand to cards on the board, and that is gaining and adding to tempo. Who's ahead on it? Who's behind? What can I do to wrestle back tempo if the opponent's ahead? What can I do to remain ahead on tempo if I'm in front? The green-purple decks are basically just straightforward, flat-out tempo decks. That's what they do. They tempo. They just add to the board while pushing cards off of the opponent's board. It's usually done through things like Cloud Kicker or Mother Knows Best. Those cards are perfect examples of tempo cards, and they help keep you ahead on board. Having a curve of being able to go Curse Merfolk into Ursula into Kit is really important to maintain a tempo advantage. So having a curve can be the difference between winning and losing games for an entire deck archetype, not even just a deck build in and of itself. Now that we've talked a little bit about reasons to mulligan, we have to talk about the style in which you do it. How do you accomplish it? How do you get to that goal? The first one I want to start with is the hard mulligan, because I already named and called that one out in the previous section. Sam, this is one I know you're not a fan of.
No.
Because we were talking about that when I was playing the discard decks, and you're just like, I don't like the idea of just shipping an entire 7 cards in order to find 1 card.
Right. I think the reason I'm so opposed to that is because I play such uninkable heavy decks typically. I'm not really comfortable with the idea of that, and I'm sure I'll get more into that when we get to inkability. It makes me uncomfortable.
You'll have more to say. And a lot of players do not like this style, but sometimes you need to. The reason is it's a high risk, high reward play. You'll hear me through the life of the podcast, if you haven't already, refer to the ceiling and the floor. The ceiling is the highest of the highs. It's magical Christmas land. What's the coolest and the most amazing this thing can be? And then what's the floor? What's the lowest of the low? What's the worst this card can be? Inkable cards have a built-in floor. They're only so big because they can turn into ink. That's why you see the strongest cards tend to be uninkable in this game, because the worst thing they can be is a dead card in your hand that's doing nothing. You draw it and want to cry because it's sitting in your hand doing nothing.
Right.
So that's brutal, and that's not where you want to be. So hard mulligans can force you into hands that are just flat out unplayable garbage, but they can also put you into the double bucky Magic Christmas land where you just win by playing characters, and you just go, wow, this deck's amazing. How come not everybody plays this deck? It's just amazing. When you get 2 buckies down, this deck can't lose. Well, there's a reason for that. So I want to talk a little bit about math. Thank you all for sticking with me after I said I want to talk about math, as it involves the hard mulligan. Just an idea of why is that even a good idea, or that sounds terrible. For all the Sams out there who are naysaying the hard mulligan, I do want to point out you have a 6.6% chance of finding 4 copies of a card in your opening 7. Then you have a follow-up 7.5% chance of finding it in your second 7 after you've put the full 7 cards aside. So you go from looking for 4 cards in 60 to looking to 4 cards in 53. So just keep that in mind. Right? You get to see between those cards, if you do a full 14, you get to see nearly a quarter of your deck, right? We're talking about a 60 card deck. So 25% of that would be 15 cards. You're seeing 14 cards.
Right.
You're seeing 23% of your deck by doing a hard mulligan. That's pretty crazy. I don't want to oversell it. I don't want to like car salesman this thing. It is not a coin flip. A coin flip is 50-50. If somebody said, hey, listen, let's just flip a coin to see who wins this game, I think most players of trading card games would go, I'm uncomfortable with a 50-50 shot. Until you get good at trading card games and you get like into the reckless gambling world, and you know who I'm talking to. You know who you are. We got to be careful with that. But on the other side of the coin, those odds aren't horrendous if you're going for something that's so certain that you can win the game with it. And then again, if you don't get it, it's not like you just insta lose either. You may still have a fine hand. The game just won't be as easy as if you found that key card. And that's the hallmark of good deck building, and that goes hand in hand with the mulligans, right? It shouldn't just leave you cold completely. Does that make sense? Did I say that in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, good. I tend to rattle, so I don't want to go too far off topic there. But let's move into an ideal mulligan. This is where I tend to fall because I've been playing trading card games for a long time, so I like to eke out advantages. And when I came to Lorcana, the idea of the mulligan felt so absolutely fantastic to me that I was just like, if I have one or two cards that I don't like, I'm going to try to get rid of them to get the perfect card, to turn those two cards into two better cards, to upgrade those cards. This is a reasonable line of thinking, but you need to really consider how your deck is built. That is a big function in mulliganing, and it really can hurt you if you mulligan in this fashion, because if you're playing a high inkable count, you can really set yourself up for failure. So you need to be careful. If you turn two mediocre inkables into two expensive uninkables that you didn't want to see until turns, 6, 7, 8, or 9, you could put yourself in a position where you went from doing all right in this game to losing this game because you got greedy, which I often can be accused of being when it comes to trading card games.
Right. I look at if I have a decent hand, 1, 2, 3 drop, and then I have Maleficent Dragon in my hand that I'm not going to play till turn 9, I'm like, okay, well, at least I know I have the ink for this 1 drop, 2 drop, 3 drop.
Let me ask you a follow-up question. It's game 2, and you're playing against a whole new world deck. Are you more likely to mulligan that Maleficent Dragon knowing that information?
Most likely, yes.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to call that out because so many factors impact our keep versus our mulligan.
I think it depends on the rest of my cards, though. If that's the only high card in my hand, I'm fine with keeping it.
Because you just know it'll be your
I'll
first
just know
ink
it'll
for
be
the
my
turn.
first ink.
I think that's valid. Those are things to think about. If I'm never going to play this 9-cost card that is in my opening hand because I know my opponent's going to whole new world me before I get to turn 9.
I wouldn't keep 2 or 3 copies of Maleficent Dragon in my open hand. I would maybe keep 1 for ink because I want to know that I can get to them later.
Right, because if you mulligan that Maleficent, you might draw a Be Prepared, which is equally as bad, if not worse, because you're not getting it till late game, and it's not even inkable. So you can't even have the option of just putting it into your inkwell and starting off your game quickly and kind of inking from the top and down. So that can make things very difficult as well. So consider that. And I think the last one is the one I try to force myself into the camp of, especially when I'm playing something like Amber Steel Song with a high uninkable count, is being conservative. Going, you know what? There are 4 or 5 very good cards in this hand, and there are 2 that are not so great, but could be pretty good, especially if they're inkable. I'll generally just keep them. Before, I would say most of the time I'd like to push. In the Emerald discard style decks, I'll be a lot more towards the hard mulligan or the ideal mulligan, where if I'm playing something with a high uninkable count, Ruby Amethyst or Amber Steel Song, I try to go towards the conservative end. So don't be afraid to change your style either, depending on what the deck can dictate. And that's how many uninkables there are and how much do you get punished for over mulliganing.
Do you typically ditch most uninkables?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
If I'm playing Amber, especially Amber Steel Song, if I don't have like the Shift Queen into or Shift Robin Hood or Ariel into Whole New World, the really fast Whole New World, I'll typically ink any other. If I have Whole New World and not that setup, I'll mulligan the Whole New World. If I have that set up with a fast singer, I'll mulligan anything that's not inkable besides a Whole New World. How does all this add up to getting you the best possible hand, right? That's the point of this whole conversation. How do I get the best possible hand? I think we kind of talked about it, but I think it's worth resurfacing the key pieces here. Identify the best possible hand. That's your first goal. Okay, we're talking about getting the best possible hand. Okay, well, what deck are you playing and what is that?
Yeah, what
does that mean?
I think you have to just know your deck. You have to have experience playing it over and over again so you know what your ideal opening hand is and against what deck.
If you could go through your deck and you could pick out a 7-card hand, you could just pick it, what would those 7 cards be? It is pivotal that you identify those with that deck. Because if you can't, then you're missing the core concept of the deck, and you need to make sure you fully understand that that is the best. Now, it could change. 2 cards or 3 cards could change depending on the matchup. I understand that. But you need to understand, like, what are the best cards in your deck most of the time so that you can make sure that function. The Madam Mim package, having those Madam Mim cards and the cards that allow them to be played. That's an important piece of the puzzle, right?
Yeah, I feel like it's those games where you go, I just had the perfect opening. You need to know what that is. Keep note of that.
That's right. The important cards in the matchup can change, but having the right cards in your opening hand, there's usually always going to be 4 or 5 that are correct most of the time you need to understand what that is. You also need to understand what the worst possible arrangement of cards can be to see in an opening hand. They could
7
be
uninkables.
They could be your best cards. They could be, oh man, my hand's full of Tamatoas, Lucky Dimes, and Gastons. Okay, well that's horrible.
What are you doing with them?
Yeah, that's horrible on turn one. You want your Palpsicles and your Captain Hooks and things like that in your opening hand.
Flaversham.
Your Flavershams, you want those in your opening hand. You don't want the high-end pieces of the puzzle in your opening hand. So consider that. And also you need to make sure that you learn, not only identify the right cards, but identify the things that allow you or allow those cards to best serve you. Again, going back to the Madam Mims. Bucky's great, but if you have a hand of Bucky, and then no Floodborns, that's rough. That's a rough hand. Like those two Buckies are going to sit there and they're going to get grab your swords. Or your only inkable is Jafar Dreadnought or the Beast, Tragic Hero, and then they just completely murder your board before you get to actually play these Floodborn characters. So you have to really keep in mind what are the things that allow you to actually use those cards. Very few cards in Lorcana just on their own do something amazing. The new Ursula, the legendary Ursula that sings a song twice. You need a song to sing twice. Beast is one of the few cards that sits there and kind of functions on his own to snowball, but you need to take advantage of the other cards it's giving you every turn.
Like Flaversham, you need items.
You need items. It's rare there's a card that functions singularly of itself, and those cards tend to be some of the stronger ones, but you need to be able to find and have these other cards. So you need to understand what makes those cards so good when you do finally have them in your opening hand. So it's having a good understanding of the deck, having a good understanding of the matchups that you're going to face, and having a good understanding of where you're at in the match. What game are you on? Are you going first? Are you going second? All of that matters so much when it comes to a mulligan. I just wanted to call that out and scratch the surface. We talked for over 20 minutes now about the the tippest tip of the iceberg when it comes to mulligans. This is such an insanely deep topic, much like inking and things like that. But in order to get into the deeper portion, we have to start at the top. We have to work our way down in these long conversations. So I think this will be a good fundamental starting point. So when we go to talk about it, we can reference this episode and we're all speaking the same language, because that's also really important. Understanding the keywords when we talk about mulligans, understanding phrases that we use, hard mulligans, things like that. You have to understand what they mean. So these conversations are long and exhausting, but it shows you how deep something as simple as a squirrel on a piece of cardboard can actually be. So it's pretty neat and it's pretty exciting. If that does interest you, then you probably found a hobby that will benefit you for years to come and you'll draw constant enjoyment out of, which is the important thing. If not, maybe you just need to put it back and draw a new hobby. Sam, do you have anything to add?
Keep questing.